Hi everyone, welcome to Money and Me by the Coin Republic. And today we're joined by a visionary who's reshaping the future of Web3 gaming and digital ownership. Yat Siu, he's the co founder and executive chairman of Animoca Brands. And he's not just a pioneer in blockchain gaming, but he's a driving force behind the cultural shift towards stakeholder capitalism, and true digital property rights. Without further ado, Yat, I'll let you introduce yourself. I'm sure that you don't need an introduction, but please go ahead and talk about all the things that you're up to currently.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. As mentioned, I'm Yat, chairman and co-founder of Animoca Brands. We're a company that is very much engaged in delivering digital property rights, which I guess we'll discuss a little bit later as to why we think that's so important. Today, we have over 573 portfolio companies at Animoca Brands, which I think beyond the number is also an important way about how we see the future, because we think that it's very important that you give back to the ecosystem. If we take a look at some of the large companies that are obviously bigger than us in the Web2 space, like Apple, Facebook, and Google, they don't actually invest in their ecosystems. If you think about it, right? They build and they dominate and they monopolize, but they don't really construct a sort of a more sort of better framework that I think is ecosystem minded. So that's kind of one perspective. But also builders in the space, we own or are very key sort of parties to things like Sandbox and Mochaverse and Open Campus, for instance, and a flurry of other projects that we sort of help incubate and bring forward. Around digital ID or things like student loans that we're now doing, which maybe we can talk about later, which is kind of cool. And of course, the metaverse and gaming, like with Sandbox. And most recently, we also experiment and build stuff outside of supporting our portfolio companies around sort of, how can we make the space better? So just like yesterday, for instance, one of our teams put out basically crypto rails on a mobile game that we had on the App Store after the judgment against Apple, forcing essentially Apple in the US to open up third-party payment systems. And that's actually interesting because it opens up the gateway for crypto adoption on the App Store, which was something that wasn't possible before, right? So we do a whole bunch of stuff. We're about 1,000 people worldwide. We're actually an Australian company, but we have our headquarter in Hong Kong, but we're globally operated and sort of building in the Web3 space. So, yep.
Oh, that sounds amazing. And quite a few of the things that you said about building the market and how you want the market to sort of reconcile together, I feel it resonates with a lot of people in the Web3 space, especially builders. In a previous interview that you gave that I saw on the news, you mentioned you described Web3 as a tool for creating a fairer form of capitalism. How do you sort of reconcile this vision with the speculative frenzy we often see around crypto markets today?
Well, so first, I think we have to sort of define the basics of capitalism, which basically starts with property rights, right? When you think about sort of the contrasting side of the ultra form of socialism, as in communism, it's actually about the abolishment of property rights. And I think most of us will agree that we want to have our property. We want to own our own name. We want to own our house. We want to own our assets, right? And because we have ownership of something, we have the ability to do and transact with whichever way we like, right? So meaning that means that I can trade them, or I can transact with you, or I can do all sorts of things with them, and you have the freedom to do so, right? And again, this is where you go back to some of the earliest sort of, I guess, economists when they talk about sort of the fact that you have property gives you that real freedom. So I think we agree with that. But the problem that we have right now with, I guess, a form of shareholder capitalism we have right now is that concentration, which is that once you concentrate a lot of wealth, you concentrate a lot of power, and then you get a monopoly effect, and then you get abuses of this. And governments around the world recognize this, which is why they set up this thing called antitrust, right? And that was something that actually was breaking apart these monopolies so that you can have a fairer market and a more sort of equitable framework. But in recent times, really, the antitrust has failed for the most part. If you think about it, I think the last major breakup might have been AT&T, as in, into the baby bells, which is a long time ago, right? When you think about the companies today, be it Apple or Google or Facebook or Microsoft, I mean, really, they're not one company. And they're all basically building up stuff to create basically this sort of, I would say, capitalism take sort of capitalism completely out of in a very sort of, I would say, monopolistic manner. And that's kind of the problem we have right now, right? And so, only the 1 or 2 percentile of the world actually gets to benefit from capitalism because they understand money. And the vast majority of the world still lives in a labor economy, unable to really sort of get a fair share, we would say, in the fruits of their labor. And so why is Web3 so relevant and important? It's because, you have a way in which we can all participate in the network and partake in the growth of the network through ownership in the form of tokens, because they can be distributed widely. And also they give us an ownership in this new network asset, which is basically the token, available in Web3. So to give you an example, Apple, is already the biggest company in the world. I think it's $3-something trillion, so pretty big. But it only has about 80,000 shareholders. And sure, some of the shareholders are mutual funds, so it's more distributed. But there's another reason why it's really only 80,000 shareholders, because it's not conceivable for Apple to have millions of shareholders, because from an administrative standpoint, it's not possible. But of course, you just ask this question to anyone, of your friends and say, hey, you use an Apple phone. Are you actually a shareholder in Apple? And the chances are they're not. But actually, every time you are airdropping, photos to someone else who doesn't have an iPhone, it's like, oh, maybe I should buy an iPhone with that. Or maybe every time I'm using an application on Apple, or using something, you're actually advertising the product. Every person who has a product is actually a promoter of it, and yet receives no value for it. And in a way, they should be kind of shareholders of it. But how do you do that? So with tokenization, you have the ability to literally create, you could have 100 million shareholders. Oh, sorry, token holders. And administratively, it would be very easy to do. But you can't have 100 million shareholders in any company. The structure just simply doesn't work, right? The second thing is that beyond sort of creating more fair frameworks around that, because if you look at things like Uber drivers, for instance, they're protesting obviously against Uber because eventually they're going to be made obsolete because there's going to be self-driving cars. But if Uber drivers were actually also shareholders of Uber, which in a way, it's kind of almost like an ESOP program, right? Then they wouldn't mind that AI will take over, because it's good for them, because they're going to retire anyway, and those Uber drivers were instrumental for making Uber successful, right? So that's really the point here. And then the final thing I would say is that through tokenization, you open up new frameworks of assets that couldn't exist before. And the critics would say, but it's virtual, it doesn't exist. But the largest intellectual, the largest property right that we have today in the world, that is the foundation of the biggest company in the world, is intellectual property rights, right? It's trademark, it's copyright, it's trade secrets, it's patents, right? And something like half of the American population is working for companies involved with patents. If you look at the top 10 companies in the world, they're all intellectual property companies, right? Whether this is Google, whether this is Apple, Facebook, Google, right? So really, their foundations of these super valuable trillion-dollar companies is entirely virtual to begin with, right? So I don't buy that argument, right? In fact, tokenization enables a broader distribution of that. And so we call it stakeholder capitalism, because every stakeholder, as in every user, is a participant. And you can see this with tokens, right? If you own Bitcoin, everyone else who owns Bitcoin benefits. Or if you hold Ethereum, or if you hold Mocha or Sand tokens, doesn't really matter. You're part of the network, and you grow and participate in this entire network.
Absolutely, Ed. And you do an amazing comparison between Web2 and Web3 firms, and how definitely blockchain and Web3 sort of allows a different kind of ownership, or ownership in every way, which Web2 companies do not. And when we talk about ownership, I think by default we have to talk about digital identity. How do you see the framework of digital identities change as we move towards the future? And what part do you think is Animoca brands going to play in that future that we talk about, which
So we often build products that we feel there's a gap in the market. And if we don't think there's someone else is building a better product, we just invest in them and help them, right? So it's one of the things. And what we discovered in the digital identity space is that really there was a huge gap, as in, people weren't trying to solve digital identity to create better trust. They were solving digital identity mostly around the area of, okay, I know who you are, and that's an element of trust, but trust is very multifaceted. And the basis of trust we felt was reputation, meaning it's not good enough for me to know who's your name and that you KYC'd and maybe which country you're from. I need to know, sort of more things about you. I need some kind of mechanism. That's how trust networks are built. Whether you're in a society or, for instance, if you're online, we have seller and buyer ratings, 5-star, 4-star, 3-star. Based on that, I can make an assessment, for instance, right? It's primitive, but it's a way to do it. If you get, for instance, a loan, I need to know your credit history. You don't have credit history, then why should I give you a loan? Or, how do I do this? Or, for instance, parking tickets, right? If I'm a repeat offender, then it's going to be a bigger penalty as opposed to someone who has been great at driving and always generally being a good sort of a good citizen. Like, these things are important, right? Think about sort of when you do an interview with someone, or when you're doing business with someone, what's the first thing you do? You do a background check and you ask friends and you say, hey, who's this guy? Is he trustworthy? Can I work with him? So we do this all the time. And blockchain is actually the perfect way to create a permissionless, zero knowledge way of attesting reputation. But nobody does that. And so I was like, oh, that's weird. And I think the reason we discovered why people don't necessarily promote it, although there are many people who want this, right, is because there's a certain cohort of people in Web3 that have become more dominant from the trading perspective, who like being anonymous. They don't want to be tracked, right? They don't want, and I don't mean tracking as in I know your name, but they don't want the history to be tracked, because frankly, they're trading in manners that might not be, something that people like. And that's okay. They can do what they want. But the point is that you want to be able to know who you can do business with, that you can trust in whatever frame that was. Right? Maybe the trader who makes a lot of money and is something that someone who does want. That's not. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing. I'm just saying that some projects, might be sensitive about airdropping to someone who just dumps their token on day one, right? Like that type of stuff, right? So we need to build those frameworks, and that's kind of what the Mochaverse and Mocha IDs started off. And we went from building essentially an ID system for ourselves to basically something that we can now extend to the world and offer to third parties as well, like we did with Soneum and the Anima Foundation to create an Anima ID, and some of our partnerships that we're engaging with things like SK Planet, where SK Telecom is the biggest telco in Korea. All of them basically have the ability to now sort of create their own reputation stack with it. And so you can think of this as a reputation stack that, however, is yours. Because right now, when you think about online worlds in like Web2, who actually owns your digital reputation? Not you. Your digital reputation exists on Instagram with your likes and follows, or maybe with whatever data you have on Google or Facebook on the back end. But if they deplatform you, you lose all of that. It's not yours. But on blockchain, the ID is yours and you can build that. And so we started really to do this to help support our own ecosystems, because think about it. We have 573 portfolios and growing. Many of our Mochaverse holders are going to be receiving, airdrop tokens from these projects to help them grow, like most recently with Redacted, but we've done it with Pixels and many other projects. And again, our partners want to know that it's going to people who will actually be good with the token or would be helpful to the business, as opposed to just sort of extract unilaterally. And we had to help build a system that can support that. We had this experience where we KYC'd sort of people into many of our games and applications, and we discovered that these KYC wallets ended up being sold to third parties. And even though you had a way to verify it, it actually turned out to be sort of circumvented, because they just sold the wallet, because the wallet isn't enough to be an identity. That's what a lot of people do, is they sort of use their wallet as an identity, but you can just spin one up. And because we're not giving value to people, who have sort of built a reputation on chain, we can't really distinguish them very well. And then you see this with airdrop farming. You have like some of the projects have like 90% bots, because you don't actually know if they're real or not, right? So that's kind of what we set out to solve for digital identity. And once you have a framework for that, then you actually build a really powerful trust framework. And when you have trust, that's actually when you can start really doing business with each other, and that scales and that grows. And if you think about the biggest GDPs in the world, are all the ones that have high levels of trust. And so that's what we're all about. We're trying to build better trust. And of course, the holy grail is to then finally unlock unsecured credit, which in Web3 does not exist. Like in Web3, everything is over-collateralized because you can't trust anyone. But if I can start trusting people, then that's when we can actually start giving unsecured credit.
So with Of course, Mocha ID, you guys aim to solve civil attacks and build reputation on chain, which you spoke about. So how do you convince users to actually care about decentralized IDs? Because I've often seen that convenience often trumps security, even ownership for people at the moment. When we talk about scalability and adoption, how are brands looking at it?
Well, I mean, especially after Trump was elected, every brand's out there saying, "Oh, you know what? We should be looking at tokens again." So I would say we can look at this as at multiple stages, right? Um, so first of all, when you think about many brands, there are two types of brands, right? In the traditional spectrum, actually, let's call them three. The ones that already adopted crypto very early on, especially the luxury brands, because they kind of got NFTs and understood the space. And frankly, they were smart because it wasn't just about, hey, my Birkin bag is kind of like a Bored Ape. That's one element. But it's a new wealth class. I have luxury goods. So I want them to buy my stuff. Hey, I accept tokens. I accept crypto. It's really the same thing for them. And they get it because their business is to go after the people who make money. And every cycle of wealth generation creates a new cohort of newly minted wealthy people that didn't exist before, like Silicon Valley, or in mining, or in banking, or in real estate, and of course in crypto, right? Like these moments where these people come and they make money, and there's a cohort that will buy this stuff, so they get it. So there's those type of brands, right? And they're kind of already in it. And then you have the curious ones who really see an opportunity, but they were afraid because of regulation. I think a lot of the gaming companies, especially in the West, were in that category because they kind of flirted with NFTs. They had partially the user user feedback, but the biggest issue was the regulator. If you start talking about tokens, the SEC will probably slap a Wells notice on you. That's just not a good way to do business. So they just avoided it completely, right? And so now, while it's not 100% clear, it's much more positive for sure. They're no longer negative on it. They now want to consider doing it, but they want to wait for the regulation to be clear. And so they're going to be waiting for particularly the SEC to clarify what is actually truly a utility token. And there's some politics around that. Like most recently, there's an attempted bill that apparently that's trying to sort of say that there can't be political tokens and kind of anti-meme coin in a little bit. So there's a little bit of that type of clarification going on. But once that becomes clear, which we think will happen fairly soon, then expect many brands to engage in tokens specifically as well, because they see an opportunity to continue to build the networks. And then, of course, you have the third cohort. Those are the skeptics and who just don't want anything to do with it. You always have this, right? I mean, you have people who were skeptics on video games, and you had skeptics on the internet even, right? And you have skeptics on people with the telephone even, right? Or even radio, right? So you always get that. And those typically a minority, but they tend to be vocal. We don't bother with them. But the reason why Asia has grown as fast as it has is because Asia has always been very forward on this one. Because frankly, also, and I think this is another important point, brands that are much more commercial and the community that's much more capitalist minded tend to embrace this type of technology much more. And I think that's one of the reasons. Like in Asia, it's very, very, very natural to talk about money, right? It's very, very, you're comfortable talking about the price of this and the real estate of this and the stock price of that and the token of this. You can't do this really in Europe. I mean, unless you're in a crypto community or an investor community, you don't have a dinner table conversation and talk about this type of stuff. It's considered often rude, a little bit unseemly, right? And so it's a culture thing as well, which frankly is, I think, one of the reasons why Asia, broadly speaking, has been such a growth market, because everyone has been focused around growth. And remember also, it was only decades ago, like 30, 40 years ago, where many Asian countries had literally nothing, right? So they built up their wealth, and so they're in this mode still, versus, frankly, other countries that are more established have come to a different stage, and they feel sort of, maybe they don't need to talk about that. Just as a side note, I think this is kind of interesting as well when you look at sort of, because this parallel between nations and tokens are similar with blockchain ecosystems. Like I feel this sort of, let's not talk so much about money and intellectualize things a little bit more, is kind of where Ethereum is landing, right? Not exactly, but it's kind of in that area, right? And so they went through the ICOs and went through the NFTs, and that's still there, right? But now they're beyond sort of the speculative thing, even though they do trade. There's a little bit of this, well, we don't do what these Solana guys are doing. when the Solana guys were actually doing exactly what the Ethereum guys were doing in 2018, right? But what happened was is that those Ethereum guys made a lot of money. And so now they have a certain wealth. And so they have a certain class. And so they're into art and this kind of stuff, right? And the Solana guys are getting there, but they're not there yet. And I expect that evolution to happen to them as well. And you see this cycle happen all the time. It's quite human, actually.
Absolutely, quite a fun way to put it, rather. When we talk about all things Web3, I think meme coins are one thing that cannot be left out of the culture. Now we can see that a lot of meme coins are launching their own L1s and L2s. Do you sort of see them evolving into sustainable ecosystems, or do you think that this could be just another hype cycle?
So first of all, meme coins are part of crypto culture, but meme coins is just take away coins. Memes in and of itself is culture, right? And it's something that is something that we are attracted to. They're mimetic in nature. They're funny stories. They could be cats and kittens, or it could be the American flag, or it could be Statue of Liberty, or it could be some painting. But these are all memes. They're aspects of our culture, and so it's important. And I think the difference about meme coins versus memes broadly is that everything that Web3 touches creates a financial element around it, and financifies it. And so that means you now had a way to measure the culture or the cultural strength of a meme through finances. Now, this may seem, again, for some people as unseemly or like inappropriate, but actually, when you think about pricing is actually a form in which you measure attention, right? And is a form in which you allocate resources and know what's happening in the world. Like if oil prices go up or down, you kind of know what's going on, right? Or if commodities go up and down, there's pricing information. And by the way, this also means we allocate accordingly. Like if oil is high, then we maybe look at other forms of energy, right? Or there's market pricing, and we do this all the time in the stock market as well, right? So this is normal. And so this kind of pricing as information, which is kind of what Polymarket does, but more in a betting setup, a prediction market, but it's the same thing. Using essentially what's at stake in capital, you get information from that. And meme coins are basically expressions of that information for memes and culture. Now, that doesn't mean you can't manipulate them. As we've seen, those are manipulated. So take away the ones that are heavily manipulated and assume for the ones that are actually really decentralized and open, you get indications as to where attention is. Like for instance, the example I often give is, I got kind of cool with my kids a little bit because of the fact that I was able to talk about Chill Guy. They're like, how do you know about Chill Guy, right? I know about Chill Guy because there was a meme coin attached to it. I didn't know about Chill Guy because I was on TikTok, but because of that, I was able to get attention from that. It's kind of like a news headline almost, right? And so that means we shouldn't be surprised if a Trump token does well, because where's all the attention, right? And we see this, for instance, when you have like millions of followers or you have viral videos. That's actually a financial value attached to it. The difference, though, is that the financial value of a viral video on YouTube goes to YouTube. Okay, it doesn't, and you don't know how much they make on it, and you don't know what network they create from it, but they make money from you. Versus in Web3, it's much more open and transparent. There are obviously problems in the sense that the way that money flows and the fact that it can be manipulated and so on. Those are real issues, obviously, that need to be addressed as you have in any kind of sort of maturing technology. But I would say that meme coins are just an expression of the financial information and market information that tokens broadly do. And that means that if there is a hot trend, it doesn't have to be meme coin. It could be any trend, right? Like last year was AI. Every AI token was flying last year, right? And they weren't flying because there were more people using it in Web3. They were flying because investor sentiment was high. And that's the thing. When you have something that has a financial element attached to it and that becomes tradable, it actually becomes a part of the ecosystem and becomes a part of your pricing as information, which normally in Web2 you don't have to deal with, which is why it's so unfamiliar. But if you're essentially in the market, you always think of it this way. So I would say that's so I don't think meme coins are going anywhere soon. I think they're a very important part of our culture. But are they going to be as prominent as they used to be? No. I don't think they're going to be the predominating, sort of the dominating narrative. But if you think about it, Bitcoin really started off as a meme coin in a way, right? its origins are meme-like in nature. It's like, financial freedom, true decentralized money, right? I mean, these are concepts that are cultural and they're meme-like more than they're actually sort of fundamental. It wasn't backed based on anything. And then now, of course, it's become something much more fundamental because its network effects have grown, right? And I would say this is true for many things, not just specifically to meme coins.
And finally, getting back to one of the topics that I think we love talking about when you're around, which is gaming. I think a key question that Web3 games still have is how do they balance fun and financialization so that they can avoid being like a work to earn sort of a chore. And also, we've been wondering when Web3 games will sort of be at par with like a GTA or one of these top games. Is there a future where you see that happening? And if so, how do you see that happening there?
Yeah, so a couple things. So first of all, things like play to earn have gotten a bad rap just because they felt that it was, something that really was, inflationary from a token standpoint. But just to be sort of be clear, the bad rap really came from people who bought the tokens, who were investors in the token, and obviously they didn't want other people to sort of sell down the token. So they were really having a very sort of single lens from it, as opposed to thinking about how it expands the network. Now, so I want to first sort of point out one thing around money generally. Money is a social construct, as I think most of us here recognize. More importantly, money gets its power. I'm not talking about preserving value. That's different. As a store of value, we could say money is probably broadly gone. But what makes money powerful is a social construct, the fact that everyone uses it, which means that the distribution of money is actually what gives it power. Meaning the more people who have the same money, the more power the money has, the more influence the money has, right? The more network it has, right? So in other words, there is an interesting parallel around saying, oh, I don't want you to have the token, or I don't want you to have that money. But if you're the only one who has the money, it's worthless, right? So money has to be in circulation, and that's true for tokens. Like if everyone owns a token, or only 10 people own the token, there is no network. There is no value, right? So there is this dimension that you need. So play to earn really solved a few things, right? And again, it's not the only thing about ownership, but it's important to have the distinction, which is one, it offers a distribution of money, or tokens in this case, to expand the network. That's the first point. It has a financial energy, which means that there's a way in which people can trade them, which expands the network in and of itself, right? And then the other thing is that beyond the social construct, it also has other ways to engage because it's permissionless and composable. So people can build new networks on top of a token. They can, create lending platforms, so they can add utility to it and create all of these new frameworks because of the fact that you have ownership, and this goes on, right? And then the other thing is, of course, it's actually the inverse of marketing. So in Web2, we spend $1 trillion a year advertising. Most of that money goes to Facebook, Apple, Google, those guys, which is why they're so successful and so big. That's really marketing attention. Now, what happens though, and for instance, in the gaming industry, you spend $100 billion a year advertising basically people to come play your game, but the gamer gets nothing. And Apple or Google receive most of that money, don't actually invest in game companies. So just think about that. So this is a massive amount of extraction that goes into a network whose sole purpose is to connect you to a user for a very, very high fee with a very, very low success rate in the hopes that your game could become popular or your product or the application, right? Now imagine if you gave that value to an end user instead of a platform, which is basically what we call an airdrop. And that user, he may sell it, which is basically the cost of marketing. Let's call it the unsuccessful advertising campaign. But the chances of the people using it in your product is infinitely higher than giving it to Apple, obviously, right? Because Apple will guarantee you spend nothing. And so it's all the same, meaning if the product is good, they will use the token to try the product. If the product is not good, then they will not use the token and sell it, right? Which is no different than you spend $1 million advertising, and it could be lost too because it's just not been effective because the product isn't good. So I think play to earn is actually a very superior form of marketing and is actually a better form of engagement. But it's just one that people misunderstand in the context of it because they don't compare it to things like advertising and marketing. And then when you go to things like, in our industry, we talk about this thing called Bartle's taxonomy, which is a way in which we classify gamers. And they're typically classified between things like killers, achievers, adventurers, and of course, social. What's interesting is that the adventurers and the achievers and the killers only represent 20% of the gaming community. 80% is social. So it's kind of like if you ask your kids, why do you play Roblox? Chances are they'll say, because my friends are. Right? It's not they're saying because it's the most beautiful or most attractive game. Right? It's clearly isn't. It's because their friends are playing it. So social is the glue. Right? And the achievers and the adventurers, though, are the ones, call them almost like the alphas, that bring the social. Right? They love the game so much, and then they tell their friends, you should play this game, and then their friends play the game. And so they're ones that drive it in. This is the same for content producers too, right? You've got like the 10-20% that make the content, and you've got the rest of the guy reading it, right? That's kind of what we see in social frameworks. And so what's happened in Web3 with tokenization is you've created a new person in the framework. It's called the person who's there to make money, okay? It's the investor, it's the capitalist, it's the merchant, whatever you want to call it. That person is also an alpha, as in he comes into the game, he comes in to earn money, but then he brings his other friends to come in to earn money too. And the next thing you know, they stay for social. That's what happened with Axie. So when you talk about the critics, they will say, oh, Axie is dead. And so yeah, Axie isn't as big as it was in 21, 22 by itself, but it has a sustainable, long-term, loyal community who came for the money and stayed for the culture and the community, right? So I would say, it's not dead at all. It's a very, very good model. It's just how you frame it and how you think about it. Yeah.
Absolutely. You briefly mentioned about AI, and of late, AI has been definitely in talks. A lot of companies, including Facebook, sort of rebranded to a more AI centric identity. What do you think the future of a blend of AI, Web3, and blockchain is? And there are a lot of predictions that everyone has made about 2030 and how AI will take over and whether we'll actually be run over by robots. What do you think?
Yeah.
What do you
So first
think?
of all, I was just actually digging through some old slides back in 2018. We're public companies, so you can see it on our website. And we actually had a slide. It was called the yin and the yang. And I think the yin was AI and the yang was blockchain. And it's interesting because when we talked about it in 2018, 2019, a lot of people were like, what bullshit is this? And now, now look where we landed, right? But why did we talk about that? Because we thought, and I think this is still true today, that the safest way to secure essentially your AI data provenance, right, and health is through blockchain. And also it's a way to verify your ownership of something in which you can receive rewards for, at least accreditation for. And also when you think about an AI that might be autonomous, which is what blockchain can do because it can exist on chain, how do you govern it? And that's kind of where DAOs are interesting, because you can give token holders the ability to vote and control. So I would say sort of direct the AI in the future when it becomes autonomous. And this is because we are in a world already where an AI can basically mint their own tokens. And so when they can mint their own tokens, it has actually for the first time the ability to create some form of power. Right? Right now most people think of AI as a tool because they so-called control it. And I'm not gonna, I'm the paying customer. So, you're my service agent. But what if the AI starts paying you, right? What if the AI says, hey, you know what? Could you do this for me and I'll pay you $100? How many people will do it? And the point is a lot, right? And with airdrops, like over the last 4 years, we dropped something like $48 billion in airdrops. How many millions of people were working for airdrops for protocols? What's the difference between a protocol and an AI? Not that much, really. I mean, right? It's still virtual. It's still something you don't see or know, right? Sure, the protocol could have some humans behind it, but people don't say, "Oh, I work for Vitalik," right? When they get an airdrop there, or they don't think I work for Yuga Labs or for Pudgy Penguins or for Mochaverse. They don't think this way. It's the protocol that gave it to them. So replace protocol with AI, and that's kind of where we are anyway. So that means that we're entering a future where AI is giving us work. And that means that there's a clear blurring of that. And to me, though, the opportunity is that tokenization is the way in which you can protect that, which you can guide and govern that. And frankly, I see better job opportunities for people around the world because, if an AI has a new token for you and wants to engage you, it creates a much more bigger market around that. And I think, it changes the dimension of how we as humans interact with each other, certainly, but it becomes more transparent because it's on chain. I would argue, for instance, that we are currently living in a far more dystopian version of this because while it's not called AI, we're kind of working for Facebook and we're kind of working for TikTok because we're creating content every day, spending hours and hours making the content good for our 5 minutes of fame. Maybe it's a little longer for some, shorter for most, right? But how much do we get paid for it? And it's a big fat zero, right? And so we're basically engaged in sort of mostly slave wages or sort of no wages, and an AI will basically pay you at least fair wages, and you have a competitive marketplace for the same service.
Absolutely, that does make a lot of sense. Of late, you've also been mentioning a lot about education and how education can be a great tool in the Web3 space. If you can talk a little bit more about that, as well as the new investment that Animoca Brands, I think, made into Pencil Finance. So, if you can talk how education is going to run the sector, or why it is a core need.
So yes. So first of all, education, fundamentally, is something that is always critical for nation building. There is no nation that's built without education, right? And what we're building the crypto nation. So we need to basically help people on board with what is not just crypto and how does it work, but just generally the frameworks around that. So that's let's call it the high philosophical perspective. But how do we get there, right? So first of all, a big part of being comfortable in Web3 is financial literacy. So we really, really need to sort of expand that universe. That's kind of the first point. In terms of making people more financially literate. The second thing, of course, is that the area of education that we can also do is we can disrupt current forms of education. So it's a little different, not just about how do you become Web3 native, but also how DeFi and Web3 can actually make education systems that is a 5 trillion market today much more efficient. So most recently, at Open Campus, which is basically powered by our EDU token ecosystem, we've announced essentially our sort of financing and support for something called Pencil Finance, which is built on EDU chain. And what they do is they do student loans on chain. And we just offered the first $10 million for that for student loan financing, generally in places like Indonesia and Philippines for the time being. Now, why is that relevant? It's relevant. It's really relevant because the students pay very high interest, especially in those countries because there's no federal loan programs for them. And the reason why is because the intermediary loan providers have to pay very high interest because their cost of borrowing is like 15%. But if you think about the yield that you can generate in DeFi, you could reduce that cost of interest substantially. And then what happens is that you can pass on those benefits. The student actually ends up getting a wallet. He can earn tokens through airdrops and that kind of stuff to maybe pay back the loan or do other stuff. But more importantly, he gets onboarded. If he has to pay back his student loans on chain, he's there for life. And you think about it. This is how PayPal and Venmo and those platforms onboarded themselves as well. They started with the students. You start with the younger generation, right? So that's critical. But the real goal here in all this is, what are the superpowers of Web3 really? Is that once you're fully onboarded to Web3, you become much more financially literate. And this is really the struggle we have in the world, which is that I think there's a world between those who understand or at least appreciate money and those who don't. And the 1 percentile, the sort of rich capitalist class that a lot of the people are sort of lately railing against, are actually the ones who understand money. And it's because they've had an advantage, or they studied it, or their parents taught them, or some version where they had something. It's not hard, really. It's an attitude to risk, and it's an attitude to investing that most of the world doesn't understand because we don't teach it at school, right? I mean, just think about it. Most people learn about money when they take a loan out for their student debt. Okay, that's insane, right? When we could do this for children on day one. And so if you improve the financial literacy of the state of most people around the world, then everything will change, not just liquidity, but also in attitudes to investing. The kind of scams that people are afraid of can't really happen because most of the world knows how to deal with it, because most of the people would be financially literate, for example, right? So this is kind of the goal that I think sort of Web3 can really deliver. There's many other things, but I would say, the one thing to contemplate, like student loans is globally a $3 trillion market. If you can move 10% of that on chain because it's better, faster, and cheaper, then you basically add $300 billion of TVL on chain, which makes it 3 times larger than the current TVL on all DeFi. Right, so this illustrates just how early we are on one hand, but also how amazing the opportunity is for the space.
Absolutely. Finally, can you mention a few roadblocks that institutions have in terms of recognizing Web3 as a power that would truly change the world? And while you're at it, it'll be great if you can talk about a couple of things that we are expecting in the next 5 years to happen from the sector at large.
Well, it's so much, right? 5 years, like in crypto, 5 years is like dog years, right? So it's like saying, well, what's going to happen in the next 30, 40 years? It's like, wow, okay, the whole world will change. So first of all, generally speaking, I do believe that, of course, mass adoption will take place, frankly, earlier than that. Not just driven by gaming, but just generally with the policy regulation frameworks. The fact that the US is so pro-crypto is going to actually end up forcing every other nation to do it. Right? Just imagine if you're a bank that ultimately has a stable coin in the US and wants to send the stable coin for your business that you're doing with America, and the other bank says, I can't receive it. Please do something else. It's just people are just gonna have to adopt it, right? It's kind of like how people adopted the internet. It's kind of how people adopted fax machines or telex, right? It all happened because there was a commercial need around that. And so basically, that's going to be one of the mass drivers of that. And that's the reason why Animoca Brands is also doing the stablecoin joint venture with Standard Chartered, for instance, right? In Hong Kong, because we do think it's a big part. And so you see this wave of institutional adoption. But I would say the other thing that we think is going to be, again, we certainly have been backing this from the start, but I think gaming is going to have its big moment probably towards the end of the year and early next year, precisely because regulations are clearer and large game companies are going to start thinking about tokenization, or at least not going to stop it. So for instance, GTA 6 is now scheduled to come out next year, delayed once again. However, what most people might not realize is that you can run your own GTA servers. And those GTA servers could run crypto, which some people are talking about that they want to do. And for those who don't know, GTA is Grand Theft Auto, biggest game in history, probably the biggest game launch ever. And I think the thing here to sort of contemplate is that previously GTA or any one of those game companies would disallow it because they were afraid of the regulatory issues. And now they don't have to. It doesn't mean that they issue a token, but they're not going to stop their community from doing this, if you know what I mean, right? So as a result, you get this type of composition and tooling and third parties engaging with this. And I expect social networks and platforms to all engage with this. And then look, for instance, what happened with Apple. Like, we just we were just able to launch with Crazy Defense Hero. Our team did an experiment using the Tower token. And so now you can pay for your in-app purchases effectively, or basically your purchases inside the game, using a crypto token. In this case, it's a Tower token, but it could be any token, right? And buying items outside of the App Store, but within an app, which was disallowed before, but because of the US judgment, Apple had to force open for the US market anyway. So all these factors are going to sort of drive mass adoption around that. And of course, we're all trying to get there in a hurry, which is why we're doing stuff in student loans and gaming and digital identity. But we're all building parts, and they will ultimately all contribute towards that. Yeah.
I have one last question before we quickly
Of
wrap
course.
this up, and it's been an amazing chat without a doubt. What is Animoca Brands' roadmap for the coming year, and how do you envision Animoca being like a key placeholder in the larger ecosystem?
So we see ourselves as ecosystem builders and supporters of the space. Obviously, Animoca as a company, last year we reported our financials. I think we're possibly one of the largest, if not the largest, non-exchange, non-hedge fund, market maker type company in the space. And I think it's important to also demonstrate to people, to show that if you're in arts and culture and entertainment and mass consumer applications, there's money to be made. And there's actually proof that, crypto isn't just about financial services, right? Last year we had we had 340 million in revenue and close to 100 million EBITDA on billions of dollars of assets. And that's important because this is where other people who are not in the finance world, which is most of us, would say, well, what's in it for me? Or how do I participate? Or why should I even join this? Because it feels very Wall Street-like for most people outside of crypto, right? So we want to continue to sort of demonstrate that. And how I see Animoca Brands is, I don't know how many portfolio companies you'll have at the end of the year, but hopefully it'll be at least 700, I don't know, or 650, something like that. I have no idea. That depends on the team. But the point is, we want to keep putting money into the ecosystem. As tokens grow, hopefully we'll be an index for that, because we're so broadly participated in that network. And I see Animoca really, hopefully, as a good example of the space and one that can help guide the space more broadly. When we think about how we invest, for instance, in Web3, the model here is, we make money and then we put money back into the system and we bring new users into it. And as new users come into the system, they use the products of our portfolio and us and others as well. And generally, we all grow together. And that's, to me, is actually a much healthier framework. And it kind of is another way of saying we're all stakeholders, right? Stakeholder engagement and capitalism isn't only about sort of how much money you make or how you share it. It's around basically building a healthier, better, and more sustainable future. People talk a lot about sustainability, talk about keeping things green and making sure we don't erode the earth, all very important. But I think the other part that we've forgotten in this process is that actually managing our stakeholders to be sustainable long-term means that we need to be willing to share and means that we need to be willing to put back into the ecosystem. Most people don't remember that after the war, taxes in places like America and Europe was over 90%, right? It was really, really high. And what happened was that even though we may all agree that government is an inefficient capital allocator, as taxes lowered, it wasn't that companies broadly started to invest more, as we see with the likes of Apple and Google. It's that they benefited from lower taxes and just kept the money. The top 10 companies in the world have over $1 trillion of cash. 1 trillion. That's unproductive capital. That's doing nothing. It's sitting in Ireland collecting interest, right? I mean, just crazy, right? Apple has I think $160 billion of assets or something like that, last I looked. If they took 5 or 10% of that money and made a startup fund to basically invest in app stores company. They don't have to invest in Facebook companies, right? Just companies that build on the app store and support, young startups building there. What would happen? Well, first of all, Apple would create a much more thriving ecosystem. There would be a lot more developers building. They probably would, in our case, we make more money from our returns of our capital investment than, whatever fees we make from that, right? So broadly speaking, it creates a happier, healthier ecosystem because that's what they are, right? And also, you as a developer would not complain paying 30%, which is basically a tax, because you're like, I pay 30% because I know that Apple is going to spend that money to bring more customers in because they're investing it in applications and products that build the ecosystem. So it's worth it, right? It's part of the trade, right? You pay taxes because you get government services or Social Security or Medicare or whatever, that kind of stuff. There has to be a benefit that it's attached to. And right now, there's zero benefit except the right to just exist. When the Apple judgment came out, Epic obviously sort of rode a victory lap, and the ecosystem was like, yay. Every Apple developer was like, this is great. Who came to Apple's defense? Zero. Nobody. Okay? I mean, to me, that's a warning sign. People don't love Apple anymore because they're so extractive. So, but if they were investing in ecosystems and they were investing in companies to build on the App Store, and they were building, like a company like Apple has less portfolio companies than Animoca. That doesn't make sense, actually, if you think about it, right? I mean, and if they took 5 or 10% of their cash and made an ecosystem fund, it would be the largest ecosystem fund in the world, including some of the biggest VCs. And it's nothing to them. It's like a rounding error. It's the annual interest. You know what I mean? It's like, so that's what I mean is the problem we have, and we can solve this in Web3. And as Animoca, we want to demonstrate that we can build better companies by reinvesting in it. We make money and we put back into it. And if we all do that, actually, I think the world will be a much better place.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for this amazing interview. And here's to making fun, education, and entertainment great again, while also focusing on the larger sustainability angle. So, thank you so much for making, or at least trying to make, the world great again, and for joining us on Money and Me podcast by the Coin Republic. It was my pleasure to interview you once again, and it's always a pleasure.